Hi, and welcome to Fair Perspectives, the official podcast of the pro-human movement, brought to you by the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism. I'm your host, Angel Eduardo, and I'll be flying solo again today while my co-host Melissa Chen is away. Today, I'm speaking with Dr. Marilyn Singleton, a physician, lawyer, and educator who was among the first women of African descent to attend Stanford University as a freshman. Dr. Singleton studied at UC Berkeley Law School and went on to practice insurance and health law, and teaches classes on the detection of elder abuse and constitutional law for non-lawyers. She is also a fellow for Fair in Medicine, a nonpartisan professional network dedicated to advancing the highest ethical standards in medical practice and to promoting a common medical culture based on critical thinking and the pursuit of excellence in all medical endeavors. We discuss her upbringing in a multicultural neighborhood and Catholic school in California, her and her peers' views on race and racism throughout the 1960s, her getting into Stanford University, her approach to dealing with sexism and bigotry in her life and how it differs from the way others approach it today, individuality versus conformity, and of course the goals of Fair in Medicine. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Marilyn Singleton. Dr. Marilyn Singleton, thank you so much for joining us on Fair Perspectives.
It's so good to be here. Thanks for asking me to talk today.
Oh, I can't wait. I mean, you are a powerhouse. I mean, I was looking up your biography and what didn't you do? You are a walking historical figure. It's incredible. It's so actually, we should just start there. Why don't we talk a little bit about who you are, your upbringing, and even your family. Your family has, you have such a storied history. I really want to dig into that. So wherever you want to start, give us a little bit about you.
My mother would want me to first say that I was valedictorian of my kindergarten class at Our Lady of Guadalupe. So there, said it, Mom. She was always very proud of that. She had more pictures of me in our little cap and gown and 3.5 years old in kindergarten. I don't know what they do in kindergarten anymore now. But anyway, I feel very lucky. I had great parents and a great family. My father grew up in Richmond, Virginia, went to historically Black college. He graduated at 16, went to medical school at Meharry, a historically Black medical school, and went in the Army, was at Tuskegee, was a flight surgeon. And while he was in the war, my mother, who grew up in Ohio and was also had gone to college in Tennessee, hated the weather in that part of the country. So while my father was off at war, she contacted everybody west of the Mississippi with good weather and said, "Who needs a doctor?" And San Diego answered back. So that's how I became a native Californian and how I got out to San Diego and was lesson number 1 in proactivity. And, I think how people talk about women's lib and all this stuff started in the 60s. I think, well, my mother was the original. If you want something, go out and get it and go out and ask. And that was an early lesson I learned from her.
Wow. Okay, so you are kind of a chip off the old block then, in terms of proactivity and self-startering. Okay, and so you mentioned it didn't begin in the 60s. When was this happening? Just so people are clear.
Well, it's kind of funny, and even going back, my father graduated medical school in 1939. And my mother graduated college in 1939. She had gone to Fisk, a historically Black college. And my sister and I used to laugh because we'd say, "Well, what did you major in college back in the 1930s? And she said, "Library science." And we giggled and said, "Oh, that meant husband hunting for a doctor at Meharry." She said, "Well, of course that's what it meant." But she went on to work and become a social worker despite our ridicule of husband hunting in college. But it's fascinating to me when I listen to the young people talk now because they do act like these things just started. Well, my mother's college big sister, so we're talking again in the 1930s, became a dentist in the 1940s after the war. And she had a huge dental practice in Los Angeles. And I just have to smile because people act like now is practically the first time you'd ever see a Black woman dentist. And I think, gee, Pat Shook, she's now deceased, was a dentist in 1940. And I love telling people that because they kind of think, well, didn't all this just start? And it's like, no, people had this kind of strength and smarts and fortitude and did all this stuff on their own years ago.
Wow. Okay. So you were primed, I think, the stage was set for you, but let's talk about you. Let's talk about your, being a native Californian. What was it like when you were growing up? What was your kind of upbringing like?
It's interesting. I think a lot of people don't realize that California back in the day had, as we call it, unfair housing. We lived in a segregated neighborhood, and we kind of lived on the good edge. And a lot of people who, again, you have to kind of think back to the times and realize history that, well, gee, your father was a doctor. You would have been living in Mission Hills. That's where the doctors and lawyers lived. And it's like, no, not a Black person. Yet growing up, we didn't feel deprived or, it was, yes, unfair, but we didn't sit around complaining. We always did the best we could. And interestingly, my birthday falls very late in the year. And one of the reasons that I went to Catholic school is the public school said she's too young to start school. And the Catholic school said if she's toilet trained, she can start school. And so that's how I got into Catholic schools. And I have to say, there's still a respite for people who live in bad neighborhoods. I can honestly say we didn't see color in Catholic school. We saw language because my school allowed students from Tijuana to cross the border and commute to school. And so a lot of the kids on the playground spoke Spanish, even though there was no such thing as bilingual classrooms. They spoke English in the class. So consequently, everybody spoke Spanglish at recess and, lunchtime. So that was kind of funny. But that was kind of, let's say, the only racial difference, if you want to put it that way. But everyone, we still treated each other the same. And it was only later in growing up, I stopped going to Catholic school in 10th grade because at the time, and this almost sounds funny now, the public school, the downtown public school, had more opportunities, more classes. People will find this hard to believe, but my public school taught Russian, Latin, the usual Romance languages, and something called Esperanto that a lot of people don't know what that is. And what Esperanto was, it never really caught on. It was supposed to be the international language, and it was a combination of multiple Romance languages. And my school even taught that. And my sister and I used to always win the nationwide Latin test for the school. They were very advanced in Latin. And this is a public school in any event. So I started going to public school. And I remember my first day at San Diego High, I went to the bathroom and there were girls fighting in the bathroom and taking each other and banging their head up against the stall door and pulling the hair out by the roots. And I'm like, oh, mother,
Wow.
where did you send me? And that's where I saw true racial divisions, but it was in such a different way than what they're saying now. We had different hallways. Who knows what they're like now, but they had WAP Hall, Skin Hall, Splib, which was a nickname for Black people, Splib Hall. And people of different racial groups had their lockers. Not that you couldn't have your locker anyplace else. It was just sort of hip to be in one of those halls. And
so it's a self kind of segregation thing going on.
Yes. And
that's interesting.
It was. And thinking about the hallways with the lockers, because there was senior hall, junior hall, and there was no sophomore hall. It was like your locker was wherever it was. But people had their lockers wherever they wanted it to be. So
interesting.
Yeah, and they had gangs, but nothing like gangs now. People didn't have weapons or anything like that. And the kind of stuff they did, they'd light fires in trash cans and throw the trash cans down the stairs, all that sort of stupid kid stuff.
Well, I want to let's situate ourselves. What you're talking about this transition in high school, but actually, I'd like to back up a little bit because even your experience in Catholic school and just beginning there and what you just described about it being very multicultural, especially given literally we have people from Mexico coming across the border to study there. That seems like an interesting kind of bubble that you were in, as opposed to what we kind of historically understand as what was going on during that time. So, you mentioned, well, first of all, we're talking about private school, right? So, and both your parents are very accomplished professionals, right? So you already had a kind of different track that you were on.
Well, it's kind of funny though, because Our Lady of Angels, just like where we lived, wasn't in a good neighborhood or anything. And, it was low tuition, $5 a month, which I don't know what that would translate to now. But so the people there were not well off by any stretch of the imagination. It was the neighborhood Catholic school. And since we were Southeast San Diego, that those were the kids that were at the school. But, back then, and I don't know, now Catholic schools, some of them still have uniforms. We had uniforms. And one of the principles behind having a uniform is nobody could compare clothes. And so-and-so had, a hipper dress or better clothes or any of that sort of thing. So we all had the same little pleated skirts and jumpers and, white shirts and saddle shoes. And it's unfortunate. I wish all schools had uniforms. And in fact, some of the Caribbean countries do that for that very reason, that it takes a social stratum out of clothes.
Well, I struggle with this because I went to Catholic school for 2 years, first and second grade. And I loathed that uniform. I couldn't stand it. I did everything I could to ruin it. I would scuff the knees up and I would lose my tie. And I just couldn't, it felt so restrictive and I couldn't stand it. And I was so excited when my family moved to the suburbs and I was going to go to public school. I was so excited about it. I was like, oh my God, I can wear shorts. I can wear sneakers. I'm so excited about this. But on the other hand, I do see that point about, kind of eliminating that as a factor. So I'm conflicted about it because I totally see the point. I totally see your argument, but man, does it bug me still. I just have this visceral.
you have to remember, I'm sure when we were little, we didn't care, but in high school, my goodness, the whole thing, and maybe by 8th grade, when they didn't have to be jumpers anymore, all the girls would roll up the waist so the skirt would get real short.
Yeah,
I just,
yeah.
What Catholic schoolgirl didn't do that?
Yep,
But,
exactly. We're going to find a
it made
way.
you not pay attention, and it sounds so hokey, but it really did make you look at people more, and not what they were wearing, not the bling and the glitz and all that.
Right. I totally see that. And, thinking back at how I dressed in high school, it probably would have been better for me if I just had a set uniform. But I'm curious if you noticed a difference in the kind of interpersonal, intercultural climate when you were in school versus, when you go home and then on the weekends. What's going on around you? Did you notice the kind of differences in the way that people were treating each other, seeing each other?
Frankly, I have to say, as a kid, I didn't pay that much attention. On our block, we never really, our next door neighbors on one side, the Palmers, they were the white people who lived next door. And it used to be a big joke because no one could figure out why they lived on our street. And a Mexican family lived in a couple houses up the street. And, they were just like anybody else. And, frankly, we didn't really think about it. Certain things you talk about at home and kind of laugh about.
What sorts of stuff?
Well, I still have this whole thing memorized. Sometimes I wonder how our brains work. When I was in 5th grade, we were studying the Civil War. And I remember coming home and telling my parents that we had a play. And I was going to help write the play. And a kid named Raul Valderrama was the other person who was writing the play. So we wrote the play. And then we were assigned roles in the play. And I was the slave owner. So we just thought that was so funny. And the line, how do you have the Black person be the slave owner in class? But anyway.
Wow.
I know. See, that was sort of, in a sense, that color blindness. All the teacher was kind of rewarding the people who took the time to write the play. And Raoul played a slave. And I always remember his great line in his Academy Award winning moment when he ran up to me, because I was the evil slave owner, and ran up to me and said, "Save me, save me." And I look at him with disdain, and he says, "I just got bit by a boll weevil." And then he collapses over.
Wow. Okay, so this is 5th grade.
This is 5th grade.
So you're about 10 years old.
10 years old. And I think about that in retrospect and what they're doing now and dividing kids up by race. Clearly, race wasn't the issue. We were telling a historical tale, but as people living in the 60s,
right,
race was not the 50s. So this would have been the 50s that we weren't thinking about our personal race.
Right. Wow. That is fascinating. That's such an interest. I mean, if someone had done that now, it would be a scandal probably. But I wonder, okay. So I would love to know more about that. Like how did you have that in your head? Or was it something you didn't even notice? I mean, here you are, you're playing the part of a slave owner. So the subject matter is right there in front of you. But your relationship to it must be different because you're playing the opposite role in a way of what would be expected, right? So what's going through your head? What's going on there?
Well, not really, other than, smiling at the irony, but being happy to get such a great role in the play. That, that, you know what I mean? It's like where the mental priority of the 10-year-old, wow, am I excited? I get to be the plantation owner, not this little black girl gets to be the white plantation. It was just,
right.
It was more innocent.
Was there a lesson tied to this whole, production of the play? Was there something beyond just putting the play on? Was there a historical lesson about this? Was the reality of this circumstance? I'm guessing that's kind of where we were going.
Well, and certainly in that it was bad and they were bad times, and we've moved on from there. And who knows? It's hard to know what the teacher was thinking. Who can ever think back to that? And if I would have been perceptive enough, at 10 years old to read the nun's mind, that maybe that's part of what she had in mind, of having all these role reversals and everything, which when I think about it, it's pretty avant-garde for the 1950s to not have people playing the role that they're expected to be played. And perhaps part of it was showing how times have changed.
Wow.
Who knows? Yeah. I can look back as an adult and impute that meaning to it, that it's showing we've changed. Black people aren't slaves anymore. Black people can be whatever they want to be. And that perhaps that's the lesson.
Wow. I mean, I could talk to you about that for hours probably. but speaking of, being what you want to be, so you transition from Catholic school to a public school in 10th grade. Mm-hmm. And are you by then already thinking, I'm going to join the family business? I'm going to be a medical professional? Or
it was between two things: being a doctor or a lawyer. My father's, we call him distant cousin from Richmond, was he ultimately was the dean of Howard, historically Black college law school, and then became a federal judge. And he always said that I would make a good lawyer. And so by the time I graduated high school, I figured, though, I was going to go to medical school. And I wanted to be a psychiatrist. That's when I started off thinking I wanted to be.
Interesting. Well, you end up actually becoming a lawyer and a doctor. So there's that. But you are an overachiever and a half. So I'm just fascinated by these kind of conflicting contexts, because I see, we're kind of primed to see things 50 years ago in the 1960s and such as being a very particularly divided time. And the civil rights movement is happening in the 60s, obviously. There's a lot of turmoil. But in your world, you're existing in this other kind of reality where the way that you and your family, and then even apparently your school, is sort of dealing with these topics is different than we would expect. It's surprising to me to hear.
Well, and certainly the Catholic school, even up to 9th grade when I was there, certainly dealt in sort of a non-racial world. I remember in Catholic high school, it was an all-girls school, and there was one boys' school, Catholic boys' school in town, St. Augustine. And the poor boys at Saints, they got shipped around to the different Catholic girls' high schools. And on Friday, we get one Friday a month, and the boys would come over for lunch. They go to Our Lady of Peace some other Friday. I think about it. It's almost like pimping these poor boys out. But it was so a girl would have a chance to learn how to talk to a guy. They certainly, didn't have people divided up by races, and, it was all the boys and all the girls. And that was that. And then going to the public high school, there is no question that there were certainly racial divisions, and racial groups hung out with different racial groups, so that was a real culture change for me.
Yeah. Tell me about
lunch, to have only Black kids sitting with Black kids at lunch and stuff like that. But this was an amazing transition time. When we had school dances, they had a rule, the unspoken rule, that mixed couples couldn't go to dances because people mixed dated. It was like the kids weren't thinking in these total racial terms. They were still kind of more people-minded. And there were groups and gangs and all that, but that wasn't most of the people. And I remember one guy, he was a white guy, but he wanted to be Black. He always hung out with Black kids. And, when I think back to all this stuff, it just seems so, I don't know, minor compared to what these poor children are going through now, when there's less turmoil, or should be less turmoil. Back then, there were still segregated counters. We used to go down to Woolworths on the way to the bus to go home, and everybody would get Woolworths pizza slice, but they had segregated counters. And so that was kind of one of the things you did in high school was boycott Woolworths, and everybody wanted their Woolworths pizza, but you didn't go in.
And so that was you. So, you were a part of that.
Yes. So, but it was just kind of assumed that you wouldn't go in. And it wasn't like some huge badge of courage. It's like, they're not going to serve us. We're not going to go in. End of story. So you have that going on. But then on the other hand, there's other things that were so open. At the time, people are going to say this sounds so sexist, that the local department stores had little teenage models, and I was one for the May Company. They got a girl from different high schools in kind of different areas of town, and you'd model teenage clothes on Saturday and go to boat shows and stuff like that, and then get some free clothes for doing it. I never felt, and nor did the other girls feel like, oh, I was picked because they needed a Black person or anything like that. It was the person from San Diego High. And I remember one of my friends who was a Japanese girl. She was at Walker Scott's. She was their little model. And it was like people weren't even thinking along those lines, even though it's not like you didn't not notice race. And, but people did interracially date, and people used to go to a school dance with someone else. So it was a little group of interracially dating people, and said, okay, you walk into the dance with Mr. X, who's of the same race as you. But then when you're at the dance, you bum around with your mixed race boyfriend, girlfriend, whatever.
Wow. So these were these official rules that you were flouting, or were they kind of conventions that you just tried to subvert quietly?
It probably was official, but not written down, because the vice principals would say that it would cause social unrest if these things were allowed. I don't ever remember any sort of formal, we're going to integrate school dances. Kids just sort of did it and went on about their business.
Wow. So there's an interesting juxtaposition between, the outside world, the reality of, the separate counters and, these unwritten rules about, interracial dating. And then there's kind of the reality you were living and the perspective that you and it seems like your peer group had about it, where they just kind of scoffed it off.
Yeah, I mean, it's like people worried about it, and some people worried about it quite deeply.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of it, you just think about being a teenager and shifting importances, I suppose, of where you're going to focus your energy. But some things, it's like the Woolworths thing. I think about it and look at things historically, that it just wasn't, it was, let's say, a matter of conscience without thinking, oh, this is a matter of conscience, that I'm not going to go there. And I think part of it is people then seem to be raised with a certain morality that this is not the right thing to do. And it wasn't like wearing a moral sandwich board sign saying I'm a wonderful person because I didn't go into Woolworths. It's just the right thing to do, to not go in there.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's the way to be. That's the effective sort of approach. Wow. Okay. That's amazing. That's just blowing my mind just thinking about this sort of, context, because it's not what you're used to hearing about. So it's really fascinating to have that there. But, so you're in high school, you're thinking, I want to be a psychiatrist. What happens next? Where do you go?
Well, this is where it gets interesting. Now, both my parents went to historically Black colleges, yet they never suggested that I necessarily do that. And when it came time to apply for college, I said, apply to wherever you want to apply. And, we'll find the money if it's private, whatever. So I wanted to stay in California. I flirted with the idea of going to one of the Seven Sisters, which sounds like an anachronism now. That was back when Radcliffe was separate from Harvard and the various other women's Ivy League schools. And then thought, well, Stanford was called the Harvard of the West. So I applied to Stanford and UC Berkeley. And at the time, UC Berkeley, you automatically got in if you had I don't remember even what the GPA was, but I had a GPA that was certainly above whatever their floor was. And so when I was applying to college, I went in with the college counselor, who was a very nice lady. And I really think she just didn't want me to be disappointed. She said, well, Stanford doesn't take Negroes. And so she said, just so you know. And my parents said, well, of course you're going to apply anyway. So that was back in the day when there were always pictures on college applications. So they know who it was they were accepting. And so my parents were just gung-ho, you always forge ahead. And 3 people from my high school were admitted to Stanford, and I was one of them. And we were all right around each other in class rankings. I think our school had about 900 or so seniors. And I think I was 12th and Harold was 13th or vice versa. And I don't remember who Jeannie was. And so it felt right that we were all equally qualified people. There was no hint. I mean, the word affirmative action hadn't even been invented yet, I don't think. Mm-hmm. And so it was a very proud moment. Yeah. And when I got to college, I think in my class, there were 12 or 1,300 people. And I think we had about 10 Black students. So,
so it wasn't true that they don't admit people of certain.
What was interesting, I had examined that, and in fact, it was sort of true. The first Black person who'd been admitted to Stanford as a freshman was just 2 years ahead, and he was the only person. What Stanford used to do is make people prove themselves elsewhere, and then they were admitted later on. So it was sort of semi-true. And then even athletes, they'd go somewhere and then transfer. So and that was truly back in the day. That's when they had Jewish quotas, 13% Jewish quota, which, fast forward now it's Asian quotas. So
right.
That, this whole academic thing gets very screwy. And I feel very lucky to have been in school at a time when all people wanted was equal opportunity, but nothing beyond. It's just like, rank me along with my classmates and leave it at that. And that's what it was. I mean, because the kids who went there, we all had the same thing. I remember the other girl was head of the student newspaper and some sort of student office. I was class secretary, and the guy was class president. It was like, chitted off all the things and, did sports and this, that, and the other. So just like today, it's like, what's on the list? What'd you do to show you're an all-around person?
Right. And so digging into your pursuit of psychiatry and then just medicine, what was it that was propelling you to follow that? Was it just the family thing, or was it a kind of personal thing for you?
I think it was interest level. When I was a freshman and sophomore, I took all sorts of different classes, and I really enjoyed literature and existentialism. And, but I did major in psychology and took a whole lot of different stuff. And it was just more, what are you interested in? I was interested in being a spy. I thought that honestly, at the time, I thought, wouldn't it be nice if you knew medicine and could help out in that sort of way? So I had all sorts of different ideas about what to do with my life. And then ultimately, I think sometimes, whether it's a particular class, something just strikes you. But I knew I was going to go to medical school. I mean, junior year, I knew that I would be going to medical school, and that was what I would apply for. What I'd do after that, that was still up in the cards.
And you changed quite a bit. You did quite a lot. So jumping into your medical career, what happens after Stanford? You've made the decision, and now we're doing this. What's on your mind? What's going on there? And what obstacles did you face, if any?
Oh, well, when I applied to medical school, I applied to UC San Francisco, Stanford, and USC. And I went down for the interview at USC, and the fellow I interviewed with, the first thing he asked me was, did I have a boyfriend? And I just said, well, that's really obnoxious. And this is before it was illegal to ask that. And I just said, I don't think I want to finish the interview. And again, to me, that means of protest, that just spelled my mother, all the way down the line. I just thought, mother would never stand for something like that. because that has nothing to do with me going to medical school. But that was at the time when it was assumed that a place going to a woman was a wasted spot because she'd just get married.
Right.
Well, as though a married person can still practice medicine. You know?
Of course. Right. Yeah. Unbelievable.
So,
yeah.
Yeah. Now that's illegal. But and I thought, boy, because what was quickly racing through my mind, if this is one of the interviewers, that means there's a lot of people like him on the staff, and who'd want to go to a school like that. So
right.
My critical thinking had advanced since I was 10 years old, wondering why I was a slave owner.
Yeah. Well, the reason I'm asking all of these questions is yeah, obviously it's fascinating to hear, and it's just so interesting to listen to the way that you approached these circumstances, which, similar circumstances today, or at least similar situations that we discuss, are approached in a different way. And I think what's fascinating to me about you is this perspective that you have and this strength of character, right? So even that interview in that moment, right? Just blatant sexism that you're faced with, the way that you respond is unique, or it's all too rare, in my opinion. I think there's a kind of stoicism in your response that I feel we don't see as much, or we don't hear about as much. What do you think accounts for why you have that sort of wiring versus other people?
Well, I think part of it is my mother and my father, where my mother's little rule for us all through life, and this came from the idea of, if anybody ever tells you you're not as good as the next person because of your color or anything, it's like, it's not true. And it was, you never have to take low to anybody. And it was her little way of Eleanor Roosevelt saying, nobody can make you feel inferior without your consent. And this is something I think is so lacking now, that people need to hear and people need to be taught. And you shouldn't have to teach it, but that goes a whole nother conversation about parenting and people not being home, and talking to the kids and where they're getting their information from, and media telling you should act one way and be a shrinking violet. And this is, you bring it up and you say it's unusual. And certainly for a lot of people in my age group, it's not. It's like these women, when they talk about sexual harassment on dates, and it's like, I would tell these young girls, why don't you look at an old Betty Davis movie and do what Betty Davis would do if a man was getting a little funny with her? It's called a swift slap across the face. And it's called turning on your heel and saying, you're an idiot, you're a jerk, or choose whatever word you want, and walking away. And it's almost like that's not in the lexicon anymore. Whatever happened to saying your piece and walking away? It's that method doesn't seem to be taught anymore.
Yeah. Well, I wonder if it can be taught. I wonder how difficult teaching it is, because there is this, I remember being, not bullied, I wouldn't say, but, disregarded and dismissed as a kid. And I was very, very sensitive. And, when I would hear people tell me, oh, just, don't worry about that, just ignore them, I couldn't do that. It was impossible for me to ignore them. It was impossible for me not to internalize everything they were saying to me. And it took me a lot of effort as a very young kid, to develop this thing of recognizing that they don't get to control how I see myself, and that they don't get to control how I feel about myself, and that the things they say are intended to hurt my feelings, but I don't have to allow it, right? It took me a long time to kind of, get over that sort of stuff. And I wonder if it's a temperament thing. Like, I wonder if you just have this very strong temperament that comes from your parents, who also very clearly had a strong temperament. I mean, I can imagine, your parents coming up against, blatant, obvious racism because of, just the time that they were living in. It's inevitable. And dealing with it in a completely different way.
I'll tell you something about my parents that I guess you could say is somewhat revealing. Okay. My mother has blonde hair and blue eyes, and unless a Black person, we always the expression, Black people know Black. And what's the, I don't know if you've ever heard, there's an expression called being an incognito. I
have not heard that.
I think it's a rather cute one. And when my father was looking for a place to build a house and live, and realized that, okay, we couldn't live in Point Loma where they really wanted to live, he would not use my mother as the front man. And my mother, in a million years, would have never even thought about passing for white. And in fact, she used to laugh when we would go out shopping, and we'd drive up to LA to go shopping, and she'd jump in the car and she'd say, "I'm free Black and 21. Let's go." And that was kind of her.
Yeah.
Her and, so it wouldn't even occur to her. And even in her job, I'm sure certain people that she placed her impoverished students with thought she was white, because they'd make racial slurs about some of the students. And she, of course, would catch them in the act and wouldn't allow them to take any more students. But, it was like Project Veritas, the undercover mother.
Wow.
And so that's a little twist to this whole story.
There's a temperament there. There's a kind of, I don't know if anybody taught her to be that way. I don't know if that's something she learned how to do. I feel like that's just, she had that kind of strength of character, just, innately.
We didn't have any grandparents. They had died pretty much prior, certainly grandfathers prior to our birth. And there was a woman, Aunt Mary, who was like a grandmother to my mother. And we'd go up to their place every summer. They had a little farm. And Aunt Mary and Uncle Raleigh were a maid butler couple who had come out from Ohio and worked in Hollywood in the Hollywood heyday. And one of the people that they worked for gave them a little farm in San Bernardino. And that's where we stayed in the summers. And Aunt Mary, who would be, 150, so someone born in the 1800s, married at 15, just like they did in the old days, had those sorts of rules and things that I remember Mother saying. That's what Aunt Mary would tell us. And they were just kind of these simple rules for life, and simple rules like treat everybody well. And I always had to laugh, because it would first be because the Lord would want you to do that. And then number two, you never know who somebody is. They could be a very important person. So it was very, very interesting. And little things like, well, you don't have to eat everything on your plate, because we had to pay for it whether you eat it or not. So don't make yourself sick. I mean, all the little rules for life. And
it's the opposite of what I heard. Yeah.
Well, I know, it's very interesting because it's like, we'll eat all your food. The people in China are starving. And of
Right.
course, the obvious thing every kid says is, how is that going to change anything for the people in China? Are you going to package up this food and send it to them?
Yeah, right. I remember the same sort of thing. But for us, it was obviously, listen, we work really, really hard to get this food and put it on the table. You better eat it all. And it's also, I think my mother is one of her joys is feeding people. And she takes personal offense if you don't finish. If you're not licking the plate, what are you trying to say about my food? Are you not, So there's no such thing as I'm not hungry. It's
But I
So
mean,
there's that.
That's what makes us all so great, because we're all so different, and why we should all be interacting with each other, because we are different and we learn little things like that.
Right.
And, in different ways to approach things. So that's what's so bothersome, when people do start to silo themselves and just not talk to other people. That to me is fun.
That's actually a really good segue, because I wanted to make sure to ask you about this. How did you feel as you started to watch the climate kind of change with respect to these sorts of things, right? I mean, you had some experience with this, going to high school where people kind of self-segregated, and you found it strange then, but it was a little bit more, well, would you say that it was a little bit more innocuous? It was kind of like people just did it because it was, a preference, but there weren't any hard lines in that way, or?
I think you said it well. Yeah, it was a preference, and a lot of it was just a neighborhood thing. And why it didn't affect me that much, I hadn't gone to the grammar school and the junior high that the kids went to. People knew these kids from when they first started going to school. And so, how school districts are made up, where a high school takes in maybe 3 separate districts, and then they all converge in one high school. But groups of kids had gone to the grammar school and junior high with each other. So they already knew each other. So some of it was just actually knowing people. Because I remember one of the girls that I became friends with pretty early on had also been a Catholic school girl. So it was her first year in public school as well. And we just sort of met in a class and hit it off, because we were kind of, in the same boat, where we didn't know the kids growing up.
Yeah. And so when you see a kind of version of that happening again, because I feel like our upbringings, even though we're talking about 2 different time periods, were similar. My upbringing was very multicultural in the sense, once my family moved into a suburb in New Jersey, my classmates were from all over the place. And a lot of us were first generation, children of immigrants. A lot of us were immigrants ourselves. And we spoke different languages at home, and we all kind of just brought that to school. The lunch boxes would open up, and it would be this huge variety of things. And we didn't think about race in that sort of way. We didn't think about these divisions in that way, right? We divided ourselves differently. We divided ourselves by, who's got the cool stuff and who's cool, right? And it gets weirder and weirder as you go on. But I didn't have that sort of perception until we started to get a little bit older, middle and high school, and you start trying to kind of, it's, that age of identity formation, and the easiest identity on offer is these kind of immutable ones, right? Like, well, I'm this particular group, so I can hang out with people from that group. And it started to turn into that there. But even then it was sort of silly, and we kind of knew it was silly for the most part anyway, or it wouldn't keep us from interacting with each other. It would just be kind of like an extension of going home, so to speak. Like you go home to your crew or whatever, but you still generally are, there's no, the cliques were more important. The social cliques were more important. But then, as I got older, going into college and then grad school, it was much more stark, and it was much more, the stakes were higher. It was very much like, no, these divisions are clear and we have to keep them. So what was your reaction as, in more recent years, you're noticing this sort of stuff happening again in a different way?
Well, that's, you talk about going to college and grad school and seeing the divisions. I think about, college, obviously, with a handful of other Black students, you're not going to decide. You're only going to talk to those people, and you didn't even know them.
Right.
I'm sure on purpose, they separated the girls out. There were 2 freshman dorms, and I think there were 2 Black girls in one and 2 Black girls in the other type thing, so it's not like everybody was going to hang out together.
You couldn't really do it if you wanted to.
Yeah.
Right.
So obviously you had all sorts of friends, and same in medical school. You were going to be friends with whoever you were friends with. And it was interesting to me, having gone to law school. Well, it's been 20 years ago now, but it was after people started focusing on racial stuff more, and affirmative action was all the word. To have these young folks come up to me and more than once and say, "You are so lucky you went to school before affirmative action, because now I don't know if somebody thinks I'm smart, or did they just admit me for my skin color?" And I think, what a horrible thing to have to live with. And I would tell, and these kids were certainly just as smart as anybody else. And that's what I'd say, hey, take it from an old lady. You're smart. I'm in the same class with you. And you should never feel that way. But it's just like how you were saying, you had a hard time, not following the sticks and stones may break my bones mantra, and taking it to heart. That it's pretty hard to erase that thought that you were just admitted because they needed another Black person, and not because you were smart. And especially when I think that at the graduate school level, that's when you need toughness and a sense of self-worth and some ego. You need a little swag, no matter whatever your graduate studies are. You're supposed to be the expert at that point, and you can't get the feeling that you're not good enough. And I think what a terrible thing to have happened. And I think back to the strides that were made over the years racially, and definitely think back, gee, my parents, what the changes that they saw. They'd be rolling over in their graves to see kids, and it was even happening before my mother died, to see kids segregating themselves. And I can't quote her exact words, it would be X-rated, when she'd say, "What's wrong with these people? How could they be doing this?"
Right.
When thinking about that in the war, there were segregated USOs, and it was a big deal when the USOs were open to everybody, and going on vacations. I remember my parents went on a couple of cruises, and it was so exciting. They said, "Oh, they don't care what color you are." And, the captain comes and sits at anybody's table and all this sort of thing. That was a big deal. And here, these same people are having separate graduations, separate dorms, separate tables. And it's like, what is wrong with you people? And it began as sort of, well, we want an affinity group, so we can talk trash amongst each other. And it's like, fine, go buy coffee and do it somewhere.
So is that What is it? What do you think is the impetus? What do you think is motivating it? Because it must make sense, right? It has to. Nobody does things that they consciously say, this doesn't make any sense. I'm just kind of doing it and I have no idea why, right? There's a reasoning that they have. What do you think that is from your perspective?
Well, one, I wonder how much reasoning is actually going on. Let's think about you
Mm-hmm.
and your experiences and in high school, how many things you did because Johnny did it. And the old, then your mother says, well, if Johnny jumped off a cliff, would you do
Mm-hmm.
it? And it's like, no, I wouldn't.
Right.
And
but the reason you would do something that Johnny would do, right? It's not just because Johnny did it. It's because you want to belong, right? It's because you want
to belong.
Right. So what do you think is the analogous thing there for people who are actively, segregating themselves and each other in this way? What do you think is that kind of motivation?
I think they don't have to face their individuality. Being an individual is difficult. It's very hard,
right,
to be yourself. And certainly for a young person, it's very hard. And you get filled with self-doubt. And I look at how things are different, that even in your age group, and you look at the kids now who coming out of the birth canal, they had a cell phone and a social media account. And there are people who can't live without checking their Facebook or Instagram or Snapchat, whatever their social media of choice is, always having the fake friends and trying to prove how wonderful they are. Deep down inside, everybody's got to know half that stuff on social media is fake. It's lies. Nobody's that wonderful. Nobody has that many boyfriends or is that cute. But the kids kind of believe it. And so it's almost like a place that you can go hide. You just become one of this cloud of brown skin or whatever skin people or whatever group it is, whether it's LGBT or women's group or whatever, you can blend in. Now, that's not to completely discount the certain level of fellowship. It just like doctors want to get together because they can talk about things that a layperson wouldn't want to hear, or, not even like you're trashing patients or anything, but who wants to hear about some of the stuff that you just want to get off your chest? Right. Or, people who work in the operating room have a different mindset than people who work on the floor. So there's no question that people who do similar things want to discuss these similar things. The question is, having decided that being a race makes you more similar to somebody than, let's say, being a doctor, being a journalist, or being a sociologist. And that's kind of been imprinted on people, because there was a time when it was more what you did, what kind of boys you liked, what you liked to do. Were you in sports? Like the good old days where the jocks hung out with each other and the skin color wasn't the issue. You were a jock, and that's what mattered. And so suddenly to see skin color be the number one thing, rather than something where every now and then you feel like, oh, I want to talk to another Black person because I need to know where to get my hair straightened, or, whatever it might be that only another Black person might know about. It's not healthy to me.
Yeah. So what do you think is the harmful difference? I'm assuming you think it's a harmful difference. What do you think is the harmful difference between, say, grouping yourself together based on something like being a doctor or being an athlete versus something like being a race?
Because being a race isn't you, it's a part of you, but it's not you. Imagine if you grew up thinking you were something that you weren't. There's plenty of people, that's like sometimes a white parent and a black parent have a child and the child looks Filipino. Let's say you were dropped out of the sky and you grew up thinking you were Filipino. And then suddenly you find out, oh, one parent was black and one parent was white. Does it change who you are? That you grew up with the Filipino experience, but whatever you are, you are. And so suddenly you're going to go hang out with black kids because you've discovered you're black. It's just sort of an odd thing. And it's kind of the one thing you can say I agree with in some of these discussions about race. Sometimes it is a social construct. And, there are some biological things, we have sickle cell, G6PD deficiency, and, various other things that seem to travel with races. But, that you can call that geographic origin. But it just seems so odd to me that a person's experience, it's like a person's experience growing up in the deep ghetto versus that same skin color person growing up in an upper middle class neighborhood. Yes, there are going to be some things that are the same because of their skin color. But for the most part, they're in two different worlds.
Right. Yeah. So what you're saying basically is that we have to question this idea of whether there is a quote unquote black experience, right? There are probably as many quote unquote black experiences as there are black people, right? Because I say it often. I think especially even getting into we don't have to get into the rabbit hole of the biological stuff, but, even something like sickle cell, from my understanding, is much more complicated. And there are it's more about a genetic strain. And, there's some of it is in Ireland and places like that. So it complicates things. But even besides that sort of stuff, it's the idea, this is the essentialism that is inherent in that idea of a black experience or a white experience or a white point of view is making the argument that, kind of like what you said, someone who grew up in extreme poverty in one part of the country has more in common with someone who looks like them, but who grew up upper middle class in some other part of the country than either of them would have with their neighbor who grew up with the same circumstances, who doesn't look like them.
And one of the things to me that seems to get lost in the shuffle is the differences among white people. I remember one of my law school classmates who had been a Marine said that in boot camp, when the sergeant told the guys to make their beds, he said one of the guys, a white guy, didn't know how because he'd never slept in a bed. He was from the deep country and he'd never had a mattress. So his experience, is something that another just random workaday white person would be stunned to know that. So white people can be different too. And this is the thing that seems so silly when people talk about, the black people or the white people. It's like, to me, it's like the people who grew up this way or the people who grew up that way. And yes, your race can feed into it, but it may not be the primary thing that makes you who you are.
Right. So I want to make sure to ask you before we run out of time about fair in medicine. How did you, well, tell us what fair medicine is and what your involvement is.
Okay. I was introduced to fair medicine by a friend who was introduced it by someone else right after it first started, about taking this so-called pro-human approach to looking at people rather than by racial labels. And it seems quite simple. And going back to the Oath of Hippocrates, where he talks about what our duties are as a physician, is, everyone knows about not doing harm, even though he never said primum non nocere because he didn't speak Latin, he spoke Greek. But he said he would do no harm or injustice to patients. And he said, whether they be free or slave. Okay, let's bring that to modern times. So that means no matter what race they are. So we've already said that we're going to treat everyone well. Our patients deserve our best care, whether free or slave. So why do we need all this other stuff? Why do we need, which I say, to be trained, not unlike a dog who's going to get rapped on the nose with a newspaper if we don't say the right thing? Because our true training is to treat patients well, treat all patients with dignity and respect. That's what practicing medicine by the Oath of Hippocrates means. And that's what we do. And that's what drew me to this sort of pro-human approach. And I must say it struck me because of something that happened when I guess I must have been a third-year medical student on my pediatric rotation, which I had at Letterman Army Hospital, which no longer exists. It was built for the Vietnam War. And there was a birth of some twins, and the father was Black. The mother was from South Korea. And the little twins popped out. And the boy was a spitting image of the father. The girl was the spitting image of the mother. And the nurse looked at the doctor and said, well, what race should I put on the birth certificate? And the pediatrician said, human.
Oh, I love that.
And it totally encapsulated, to me, fair and fair in medicine. We're humans.
Right. And so what are the initiatives? What is fair medicine dedicated to doing, and what's going on with fair medicine now?
Well, what we're trying to do is sort of get that word out, that the idea that practicing medicine isn't based on race. It's based on our love and honor of the humanness in all people. And that's how we intend to look at our patients. And we're trying to get this out by stories, interviews, developing these diversity trainings. And I always hate that word. It just evokes trained seals to me, where it shows a different approach, that to not have a patient walk in the room and immediately label him and assume circumstances about him or her because of the color of their skin, which is the direction that this DEI movement is going, is look at the color of the skin, then make assumptions. And that it's like, no, we want to propose the idea you look at the person, talk to them before you make any sort of assumption about them. And that's standard classic medicine. There's something in medicine called a social history. And the social history is where you ask just that, things about how the patient lives, et cetera, whether they smoke, drink, how many kids they have, all those sorts of things. That's part of history taking. And we don't need a consultant to come in and say, look at your diversity, inclusion, and equity principles and check these boxes, because that's what it's become. Medicine is already becoming very based on algorithms with electronic medical records where everything is checking a box, that it puts people down that road, down that mentality of just check that box, check that box. I don't even have to talk to the person. I just see this box, boom, 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 boom. And we're trying to get away from that, get people back to a more people-to-people way. Now, one of the things we have is a Fair in Medicine open house, and that's once a month on the second Thursday. And anyone can sign up and come in. And that's where they can be kind of sessions where people just talk about things that have come up and what bothers them. We're lucky enough to have a couple of students who've come on and talk about their experience in school. We've had college students who are ready to go to medical school who wonder how are they going to deal with that kind of environment because they don't think that way. I mean, kind of people who think like us and try to help, try to mentor. We're hoping to get a scholarship off the ground. So we're new and we're working on these things. And we just more and more every month, we're getting more people who are interested, who are signing up as people hear about us.
That sounds fantastic. Where can people find more info about this? Where do you direct people?
To fairforall.org. And there's, it's easier than trying to do the Fair in Medicine to me. When you do the website, just go to fairforall.org, which is Fair's main website. And then it has the different subgroups, and Fair in Medicine you can click on. And then that brings up a whole nother web page and community page and all sorts of things that are more medicine related.
Perfect. Well, Dr. Singleton, it's been so much fun talking to you. I feel like we haven't even scratched the surface of all the wonderful things you've done and accomplished and just how inspiring you are. But I want to make sure to ask the final question that we ask all our guests. Our focus at FAIR, as you know, is providing a pro-human approach to all the issues that we've been discussing today and all the issues surrounding them. So I would love for you to tell our listeners and our viewers, what does being pro-human mean to you? And how can people be more pro-human in their day-to-day interactions?
Pro-human means to me that people are just people and we're all the same underneath. And my mother used to tell me this about men. She says, just remember, men are like leopards. They're all the same underneath. Their spots are just in a little bit different place. And that's how we are as humans. We're people. We're all the same underneath. And the way you deal with being human is corny as it sounds. You go back to the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And I'm hokey. Just try to treat people right. It won't always work, but what does always work? The light bulb doesn't always turn on. So, and you just have to accept that sometimes even being nice won't work. And so what? Move on. The next time it will.
That was perfect. Dr. Singleton, thank you so much for joining me on Fair Perspectives.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Fair Perspectives. If you'd like to support the show, you can do it by subscribing on YouTube and on your favorite podcast platform and leaving us a positive rating and review. You can also access exclusive podcast content, such as Q&As and bonus episodes, by visiting us and signing up at fairperspectives.org. For weekly Fair news and opinion pieces by members of the Fair community, visit our Substack at fairforall.substack.com and tune into Fair News Weekly wherever you listen to podcasts. If you'd like to join or support the pro-human movement, visit us at fairforall.org/join us. Thanks again, and see you next time.